Okay, so for those of us who have had an opportunity to actually digest the news that the FAA has approved Starship to move forward with their experimental activities in Boca Chica, now that we've had a time to really calm down and stop drinking champagne or whatever the hell else we were doing during this entire process, it's time to actually have a look at the final PEA and determine what really the FAA has approved. And to be honest, I've only had a chance to briefly have a look at this, kind of skim the material. So I've heard on YouTube sometimes they do these things called reaction videos where we see exactly how the creator reacts to the information as he reads it. I thought this would be a good opportunity to actually give this sort of a thing a try. So let's have a look at the final PEA for Starship to determine what this is and what it isn't right now. Okay, I think it's only fair to warn you that this is a 183-page document, but at the same time, I've had a chance to review these sorts of things quite a bit over the last year or so, given all the stuff that's been happening with the FAA lately, so I think I should be able to pick out the high points pretty quickly. And the first thing that I've managed to pick out already is in part of the introduction, or rather contained within the text of the introduction. The completion of the environmental review process does not guarantee that the FAA will issue an experimental permit or vehicle operator license to SpaceX for Starship/Super Heavy launches at the launch site. SpaceX's license application must also meet FAA safety, risk, and financial responsibility requirements. So what this was, what the whole PEA application involves, is environmental only. This was focused exclusively on what sort of damage Starship would do to the surrounding environment. But here's the good news. This approval means that SpaceX doesn't have to do a more in-depth environmental study at the site, which would take maybe a year, maybe longer, which would have sabotaged everything going on at Boca Chica. Instead, the whole thing has been brought to a conclusion, and this didn't just involve the FAA. It also involved the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Coast Guard, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and finally, NASA. And in the process of creating the final PEA, the FAA took the following subjects or categories into account: potential impacts on protected species and habitat, potential cumulative effects of the proposed project and other development projects in the Rio Grande Valley, restrictions on access to public areas such as local roads and Boca Chica Beach, level of environmental review, potential impacts on airspace, potential impacts on minority and low-income residents, potential impacts on land of cultural importance, safety of launch operations given the proximity to nearby liquefied natural gas facilities, degradation of the environment due to test and launch operations. So all of these details are really good. What it means is the FAA took all of this stuff into account, quite a number of different categories and considerations in their entire decision, covering so many things when not only involved with the environment, but also with the people of the region to determine whether or not this project would have a significant negative impact that is on the surrounding area, and they decided that that was not the case. Now, there have been some changes in the PEA that SpaceX made in the meantime as well. For example, quote, the desalination plant was included in the draft PEA because it would have been used to facilitate deluge for the launch pad. SpaceX is still considering whether to use deluge water for the launch pad, but in the event it will, it is decided that it will use truck water rather than a desalination plant. What? Now, that I find to be somewhat concerning. The fact that SpaceX hasn't really decided whether they're going to use a deluge system, that is an absolute requirement. They use that for the space shuttle all the time. If they don't use, or rather they did in the past, if they don't use that for Starship, the noise problems are going to be very significant. And not only that, the vibrations from the launch will also bounce up from the ground and have a negative impact on the ship itself. That happened with the shuttle before they made use of a deluge system, and it shook off its heat tiles. I think they sure as hell better use a deluge system, and that's a decision they need to make quickly, and I'm surprised that the FAA even include that as an option, but maybe we'll see something else a little bit later on. There's also the natural gas pretreatment system and liquefier are no longer needed due to advances in the design and capabilities of SpaceX's Raptor engines. That's a good thing. A whole natural gas pretreatment system and all the new structures that would need to be created, and also the amount of power that would be required. Apparently, SpaceX isn't going to be building a new power plant for that either, so they're scaling back some of the most ambitious construction efforts that they need to do in order to complete this project. That's a good thing. Now, there's a few changes that I've noticed in the elements of proposed action. That is to say, what is SpaceX going to be doing specifically during these test processes? And it's not a lot, really. Certainly not a lot to qualify Starbase as being a real base of operations for Starship. They just don't have enough launches built into this. Now, they've included, of course, super heavy launches, suborbital launches, orbital launches, static fires, that sort of thing. They've modified the super heavy landing to include not only the landing area or a floating platform in the Gulf of Mexico, but also to expend the booster in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, that's been talked about a little bit already. I really hope that they don't do much of that, because expending the booster in the Gulf of Mexico is essentially defeating the entire purpose of Starship. They really need to be making use of the booster repeatedly, reusing that booster if this is going to be a viable system. We're looking at only 500 hours worth of annual access restriction, so once again, that's not a lot of time. We're talking a little over 20 days worth of closures. That's not enough for a full-fledged Starbase that's having regular launches every day. If they really want to make Boca Chica into an operational facility that's launching starships on a regular basis, I don't see how the hell they can do it without Boca Chica Beach becoming SpaceX property, and that's an entirely different animal. And that reality is spelled out in the proposed annual operations. A total of 150 seconds worth of static fires on Starship, 135 seconds worth of static fires on the Super Heavy, only 5 suborbital launches for Starship, 5 Super Heavy launches, 10 Starship landings, and 5 Super Heavy landings. So we're only talking about a grand total of 5 orbital launches of Starship per year at the moment. Not nearly enough to support Starship operations, even for a mission to the moon. Obviously, a lot of work is going to have to be done at Cape Canaveral, or they're going to have to change the nature of their annual operations significantly if they're going to make Starship into a thing that actually goes beyond low Earth orbit and all the refueling that requires. Now, there's another detail that I picked out that honestly concerns me a little bit. It's under the Endangered Species Act. Quote, the FAA determined the proposed action may affect and is likely to adversely affect ESA-listed species in critical habitat under U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service jurisdiction and conducted formal consultation with the U.S. FWS. The U.S. FWS issued a biological opinion which concluded the proposed action is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any federally listed species. Okay, that's good news, but on the other side of it, the BO contains reasonable and prudent measures and associated terms and conditions to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the effects on listed species and critical habitat. SpaceX must implement the terms and conditions. Refer to PEA Appendix D for a copy of this biological opinion. Let's go to Appendix D because I have a feeling there may be a lot there. Sweet mother of God, Appendix D absolutely destroys the size of the original PEA. It's 545 pages long. Holy shit. Okay, let's try to pick a few things out of this. First of all, they seem to be very concerned about the following species. The northern aplomado falcon, I've never even heard of that, but apparently that's a species to be protected. The piping plover, the red knot, the Gulf Coast jaguarundi. Wow, I didn't even know that those were there. Ocelots are apparently there. The West Indian manatee, the green sea turtle, hawksbill sea turtle, Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, leatherback sea turtle, and loggerhead sea turtle. Holy shit, 5 different kinds of turtle? That's pretty amazing. So apparently they're going to have a lot to say about this, something I can't possibly cover in this video, but I'm going to cover the high points real quick. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of high points. These are the proposed conservation measures to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential effects to listed species and critical impact. First of all, construction measures. Prior to entry and exit into unpaved areas of the VLA, SpaceX would ensure that heavy equipment traverses over a construction shaker or rumble plates or rock bed located at the VLA to remove any sediment and dirt for purposes of preventing the introduction and spread of non-native plant species. So they're starting out with some pretty fine details at the moment, and I think it's only going to get worse here. SpaceX would provide all construction personnel with an environmental worker education briefing that would include, but not limited to, wildlife prevention measures, information regarding noxious or invasive weeds, requirements for safe handling and disposal of hazardous waste, proper disposal of all organic and inorganic litter, requirements for safe handling and disposal of hazardous waste, and finally, employee shuttle use to reduce traffic. On top of that, if proposed construction activities occur during the avian breeding season, which is February 15th through August 31st, holy shit, what is that, 6 months? SpaceX would ensure construction activities occur in accordance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, to avoid impacts to nesting migratory birds within the project area. To comply with the MBTA, project design and any above-ground utility upgrades would incorporate raptor protection measures as applicable. For example, structures would be equipped with devices to discourage nest building and perching. On top of that, SpaceX would educate its personnel on the potential for vehicle collisions with ocelots and jaguarundis, yeah, apparently they're there, and encourage personnel to utilize the employee shuttle. Okay, so operational measures. Again, SpaceX needs to educate its personnel on the potential for vehicle collisions with ocelots and jaguarundis. Apparently this is a real threat. SpaceX would continue to partner with Sea Turtle Incorporated to provide sea turtle survey data within the action area. In coordination with NWR staff, SpaceX would identify further options that would assist in protecting refuge lands and species habitats from impacts that may occur from public intrusions prior to closures. On top of that, SpaceX would coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to fund additional resources or projects to enforce the closures required for launch operations. Okay, that's a lot of stuff, and we're only just getting started. Now, to be fair, this appendix is not all bad news. For example, it talks about historical precedent at Cape Canaveral. Quote, Cape Canaveral, Florida provides a long history of launches and limited impacts to wildlife. The ESA listed Florida Scrub Jay was monitored for behavior after Delta, Atlas, and Titan launches with no apparent impacts from noise. These data came from 42 launches at a rate of 16 launches per year. Monitoring associated with the Space Shuttle program, 135 launches over 30 years, found that there was an initial flight response from birds in the vicinity, but no long-term impacts were observed. In addition, nesting wood storks were observed flying off active nests in response to launches, but would typically return within 4 minutes during the Kennedy Space Center shuttle program. So yeah, that is a very realistic assessment of what frequent rocket launches actually does to local wildlife. They adapt, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the case here, especially with all these sea turtles. And here's some other requirements. SpaceX needs to update its stormwater pollution prevention plans. On top of that, they also need to implement a spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plan. Presumably that's for toxic materials, fuel, that sort of thing. On top of that, SpaceX will not place excavated or fill material in delineated CWA Section 404 waters of the United States. Well, that's kind of obvious. You don't want to put all of your debris into any sort of protected waters. SpaceX will continue contracting a qualified biologist to conduct pre, during, and post-construction biological monitoring. This monitoring is ongoing and will continue to be conducted within 3 miles of construction areas. Monitoring reports will continue to be sent to the service annually. So that's a big deal. You're going to have a biologist overseeing everything going on with this facility for quite some time. Now, on top of that, SpaceX will operate an employee shuttle between Brownsville and the project site. We kind of covered that. It will also update its lighting management plan to account for Starship Super Heavy launches. Lighting is a big issue in terms of messing up endangered species, sleep patterns, and behavior patterns, that sort of thing. So you need to have the lights turned off unless you absolutely need them at nighttime. Also, they want to install new lighting with multiple levels of control so that lighting levels can be matched with specific activities, and where lighting is not essential to safety or security of personnel, installing timers to switch off lights in the evening. Okay, none of that is really all that unusual. SpaceX will continue contracting a qualified biologist to conduct pre- and post-launch biological monitoring of vegetation and birds. Monitoring will be conducted within 1 mile of the VLA up to a week before a Starship or Super Heavy launch and the day after a launch. So that means a biologist, from what I'm reading here, needs to give the thumbs up before a launch even takes place. And the requirements go on and on. SpaceX will initiate coordination with the service within 60 days of the start of construction under the proposed action to identify practicable opportunities to protect, restore, and/or enhance habitat for the ocelot, jaguarundi, piping plover, and/or red knot. Also, within 6 months of the issuance of the BCO, SpaceX will coordinate with the service to determine the feasibility of constructing wildlife crossings across State Highway 4 west of the first public hard checkpoint to benefit the ocelot and the jaguarundi. Boy, I can can hardly wait to see one of these cats when they actually do make a crossing. Okay, let's move on. SpaceX will make an annual contribution of $5,000 to the Friends of Adopt an Ocelot program within 3 months of the issuance of the BCO. Okay, $5,000, not a big deal. SpaceX will make an annual contribution of $5,000 to the Peregrine Fund within 3 months of the issuance of the BCO. If proposed construction activities under the proposed action occur during the avian breeding season, we already covered that, a biologist will search the proposed areas of construction activity, including laydown areas for nests, one time no more than 2 days before the start of construction within the surveyed area. If the biologist finds an active nest, construction workers and activity, including the operation of vehicles, equipment, or tools within 50 meters of the nest, will be avoided until the biologist determines the nest is no longer in use. So they have to wait until the birds leave? I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but it is pretty specific and pretty restrictive, actually. There's a lot to this that's going to be a major pain in the ass to SpaceX activities. I'm not saying it's not warranted. There's a lot of really cool animals in this region that could be endangered by the largest rocket in human history. But at the same time, if you're going to let them do it, then all of these restrictions could really create a problem. And in case you're wondering, there's a total of 75 measures that SpaceX needs to implement to mitigate environmental effects overall. So a lot of boxes to be checked before we can even think about an orbital launch test. And there are other issues as well, such as noise, and you're looking at that right now. There have been a lot of diagrams put together as to what sort of noise Starship might generate. This is the one that I'm the most concerned about. It's talking about decibel levels as high as 120 all the way out to the southern reaches of South Padre Island, where a lot of the damn hotels are. That could present a real serious threat. 120 decibels is above the recommended level for human hearing under any circumstances. We get exposed to that much in the way of noise on a regular basis, but if you're talking about people who aren't really aware of whether or not they should be wearing hearing protection during the time of a launch, and I'll tell you that's going to happen a lot on South Padre Island, 120 decibels could be a problem. However, this isn't what the PEA says. It's talking more along the lines of 100 decibels at South Padre Island, but I'm telling you, that higher level may indeed happen if they don't use a water deluge system. Now, some other interesting details of the PEA include reasons as to why SpaceX cannot use alternative launch facilities for these tests. First of all, it says that there is no ability to support development and operations at Cape Canaveral, for example, and other locations. Really, all of that has been built at Boca Chica, so alternative locations really aren't going to work out. Also, scheduling flexibility, given everything that already happens out at Cape Canaveral, trying to establish a consistent launch cadence out there is going to be a lot more difficult than at Boca Chica. That suggests that they intend to expand their operations here, by the way, and also the utilization of existing infrastructure. They have everything that they need out at Boca Chica. They don't have everything they need at Cape Canaveral. It would require a lot of changes out there, plus it would represent a threat to the existing SpaceX operations with Crew Dragon and so on if they were to move all of their operations out to the Cape. So I like everything that they're saying there, and the FAA is dismissing alternative plans and alternative launch facilities for Starship. So that's good news for Boca Chica. Now, obviously, there's a hell of a lot more detail in this whole PEA. This is hundreds and hundreds of pages worth of documentation, but here's what I've been able to glean from just reviewing it with you guys right now. There are a lot of environmental conditions that the FAA has set down. The biggest things, I think, are the fact that a biologist is going to be consulting on any and all things associated with these endangered species before any construction projects or any launches take place, that could be really problematic to the consistent operation of a starbase. And on top of that, the whole issue with noise, and as I mentioned before, the problems with an anomaly, that is a very big deal. If Starship is unfortunate enough to blow up on the pad, the destruction to the surrounding area is going to be significant, including widespread fires unless the area happens to be extremely damp, for example, in the aftermath of a rainstorm. If anything like that happens, there could be massive changes that take place with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the FAA, and perhaps even an executive order from the president, depending on how he's getting along with Elon Musk at the time. What I'm trying to emphasize is so far, the FAA has given SpaceX almost everything they've asked for. They've put down a lot of requirements, but they have dismissed any of the big concerns that have been presented about the future of operations at Boca Chica. They do not believe that SpaceX and Starship represents a significant threat to the endangered species and the protected habitat of this region, and so consequently they've given their approval without a more in-depth study, and that's really good news no matter how you look at it. Please check the description for various ways to support this channel, because I've introduced a lot of new merchandise lately that you may or may not have seen, and just smash that like and hit that subscribe in the meantime. And until Starship is actually ready to make a true orbital test, which is going to be a monumental event in the history of spaceflight, until this moment actually comes to pass, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.